I didn't break my oath the day I decided to speak. I broke it years earlier, the first time I understood that silence was part of the mission. Most people believe the Air Force keeps secrets to protect the country. That's only half true. Some things are hidden because if they were spoken out loud, they wouldn't fit inside the world people think they live in anymore. And once that happens, control becomes harder than fear. My name is Richard J. Bennett. I served in the United States Air Force. That much exists on paper. What doesn't exist are the places I was sent, the tasks I carried out, and the things I was told never to remember. I wasn't a scientist. I wasn't an analyst. I wasn't important enough to ask questions. I was useful because I followed orders, and because I knew how to keep my mouth shut. That's how they choose you. The hangar didn't have a name. It didn't have signage. It didn't officially exist. On base, maps, the space where it stood was blank, like a printing error no one bothered to fix. We didn't drive up to it directly. We took a route that looped twice, changed vehicles once, and ended with a walk that felt deliberately longer than necessary. Confusion was part of the protocol. I remember thinking it was excessive. Later, I understood it was conditioning. From the outside, the hangar looked ordinary. Dull metal skin, no markings, no windows. It could have housed aircraft parts, weather equipment, anything. That was the point. Normality is camouflage. What wasn't normal was the quiet. No idle chatter, no joking, no casual movement. Everyone walked like they were being watched, even when no one was visible. Before we went in, a man I'd never seen before took my badge and handed me another one. No name, no rank, just a color and a number. He didn't explain why. He didn't have to. The message was clear. Who you are out there doesn't apply in here. Inside, the air felt wrong. Not cold, not warm, just heavy. Like the room resisted breathing. The lights were brighter than necessary, almost flat, washing shadows out of existence. Sound didn't travel the way it should. Boots on concrete sounded muted, like the floor was absorbing more than impact. I wasn't told what I was about to see. No briefing, no warnings, just a simple instruction. Stand where you're told, look only when instructed, do not speak unless spoken to. That was standard language. What wasn't standard was the tension in the men giving the orders. These weren't kids playing soldier. These were experienced personnel who had learned the hard way that some assignments follow you home, whether you want them to or not. The object was already there when I entered. It wasn't covered. It wasn't damaged in the way wreckage usually is. No burn marks, no jagged tears, no signs of impact that made sense. It rested on a platform like it had been placed there carefully, deliberately, by people who didn't fully understand what they were touching, but knew better than to treat it like scrap. The first thought that crossed my mind wasn't, "This is alien." It was, "This was never meant to be seen by us." Size-wise, it was smaller than a fighter jet, larger than any drone I'd worked around. The surface didn't reflect light the way metal does. It absorbed it, dulled it, like the material didn't agree with being observed. There were no rivets, no seams, no visible means of access. Just a continuous form that looked engineered without looking manufactured. I remember waiting for someone to explain it. No one did. We were told where to stand, where not to step, which angles were permitted, which were not. Cameras were present, but not for documentation. They were there to watch us. Every movement, every pause, every instinctive reaction that might betray curiosity. I kept my face still. That was another skill you learn in uniform. At one point, I noticed something that still sits with me decades later. The object wasn't symmetrical in the way human machines usually are. It was balanced, but not mirrored, as if symmetry wasn't a requirement for function, as if whoever built it didn't share our assumptions about design. That thought scared me more than anything else in that room, because it meant intelligence without familiarity. No one said the word extraterrestrial. No one said non-human. Those terms are for the public. Inside that hangar, language was stripped down to the bare minimum. You don't name what you can't control. You don't define what you don't want acknowledged. After less than 20 minutes, we were escorted out. Same route, same silence, same badge exchange like nothing had happened. By the time I was back in my quarters, it already felt unreal, like a memory my mind was trying to sand down into something safer. That night, I realized something I had never been trained for. Seeing is not the same as understanding, and understanding is not the same as being allowed to remember. So I'll ask you the question that was never asked of me, not then, not ever. If something that doesn't belong to our world is quietly stored in a place no map admits exists, who decides that the rest of us don't deserve to know? I didn't tell anyone about the hangar, not because I was threatened, not because I was scared of prison. I stayed silent because silence had already been practiced into me long before that day. After the hangar, my duties didn't change on paper. Same unit designation, same schedules, same routines. But the way people looked at me did. Not with suspicion, with assessment. Like I had crossed an invisible line and now existed in a smaller circle of awareness. No congratulations. No acknowledgement. Just a quiet recalibration of where I stood. That's how compartmentalization really works. Not with walls, but with distance. A few weeks later, I was reassigned temporarily. No explanation given. Temporary assignments were common, but this one came with instructions that didn't sit right. No written orders, no digital trail. Everything verbal. Everything forgettable by design. We were told we would be supporting containment logistics. Those were the exact words. Not storage, not transport, not analysis. Containment. That word carries weight if you let it. The facility wasn't the same hangar, but it felt related. Same emptiness on the maps, same controlled access, same absence of casual behavior. What stood out this time was what wasn't present. No insignia on doors, no clocks, no windows. You lose track of time easily in places like that, and once you do, obedience becomes simpler. I never touched the object. That distinction matters. People assume these things are studied like lab specimens, poked and prodded by scientists in white coats. What I saw was closer to hesitation, distance, careful avoidance. Like no one was quite sure what level of interaction crossed an unseen boundary. My role was observation, logging reactions, not the object's reactions, ours. Heart rates, sleep irregularities, cognitive drift, small things. The kind of data that doesn't sound alarming until you realize it's being collected on trained personnel who are supposed to be psychologically stable. No one told us why. One night, during a shift that felt longer than it should have, I noticed something that still unsettles me. The object, or whatever term you prefer, appeared unchanged. Always the same position, same orientation, same silence. But the people around it weren't. Men who had been calm the first week grew irritable, short-tempered. Others became withdrawn, like they were listening to something no one else could hear. One technician quit without notice. Another requested reassignment, citing migraines. None of this made it into official summaries. I know because I helped compile them. We learned quickly what not to include. The most unsettling part wasn't fear. It was familiarity. After a while, the presence of the object stopped feeling foreign. It started feeling wrongly normal, like your mind, trying to protect itself, decided to file the impossible under routine. That's when control really takes hold. There was a moment, brief, easy to dismiss, when I thought I saw a change on the surface. Not movement, not light, more like a refusal to stay exactly the same, as if the material responded to attention without responding to touch. I didn't report it, not because I doubted myself, but because I understood what reporting it would mean. More observation, more scrutiny, more silence layered on top of the old silence. At no point was there a briefing about origin, no crash narrative, no recovery story, just implication. And implication is more effective than explanation. If you're never told what something is, you can never say for certain what it isn't. That's another kind of containment. Years later, people would ask me if I believed the government was hiding proof of non-human life. I never answered directly. Belief has nothing to do with it. Belief is a luxury for people who weren't there. What stays with me isn't the object itself. It's the realization that the operation wasn't built around understanding it. It was built around understanding us. So here's the thought I've carried quietly all this time, the one that still keeps me awake. If the greatest unknown in that facility wasn't what was inside the hangar, why were they watching the people more closely than the thing? There are records for everything in the military. That's what people like to believe. Forms, logs, after-action reports. Paper gives the illusion that reality is being preserved. What I learned is that records aren't meant to tell the truth. They're meant to stabilize it. What didn't fit was simply left out. I saw reports finalized before operations concluded. I saw conclusions written before observations were complete. Not lies, exactly. Omissions. Strategic absences. The kind that don't trigger alarms because no one can prove something missing was ever supposed to be there. I was asked once, quietly, whether I felt any lingering effects. That was the phrase. Lingering effects of what, he didn't say. I answered no. That was the correct answer. The only answer that didn't open another door. By then, I understood the rules. You don't describe the object. You don't speculate about origin. You don't use words that imply agency. And you never, ever ask why it was being kept instead of destroyed. Because destruction assumes ownership, and nothing about that hangar suggested ownership. There was an unspoken acknowledgement among some of us. Not a conversation, a recognition. You'd see it in a pause that lasted half a second too long, or in the way someone avoided looking directly at the platform. We all knew we were circling something that didn't belong to the usual chain of cause and effect. One night, during a maintenance window when fewer personnel were present, the power dropped briefly. Not a failure, a deliberate shutdown. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing the space in a dull red that made everything feel stripped down, exposed. That was the closest I ever came to panic. Under those lights, the object looked different. Not transformed, not active, just less constrained by the way we usually see things. Edges felt uncertain. Depth felt misleading. I had the overwhelming sense that my eyes were doing work they weren't designed to do. I remember gripping my hands together, focusing on the pressure, reminding myself where I was. Grounding techniques weren't taught back then. You learned them on your own, or you didn't last. The lights came back. The room returned to its artificial normal. No one spoke about it. No incident report followed. The shutdown was logged as a routine test. That was when I understood something that took years to fully accept. The secrecy wasn't about preventing panic. It was about preventing context. If you show people something extraordinary without context, their minds rush to fill the gap. Religion, fear, wonder. questions that spread faster than answers. But if you isolate the experience, if you fragment it, if you let each witness believe they're alone in what they saw, then the truth never forms. It just echoes. I carried that echo with me when I left active service. I carried it into civilian life, into conversations that never quite lined up, into a constant awareness that there was a layer of reality most people would never brush against. I tried to forget. That was encouraged too, in subtle ways. No follow-ups, no debriefings years later. Just distance. Time does most of the work if you let it. But forgetting isn't erasure. It's compression. Every now and then, I'd hear a politician dismiss the subject with a smile, or a spokesperson talk about balloons, or misidentified aircraft, or speculation fueled by imagination. And I'd realize they weren't lying. They were redirecting. Because the truth, as I saw it, was never packaged into a statement. It was distributed across rooms, across people, across decades of silence that never quite touched each other. So let me leave you with this, the thought that returns whenever I think about that hangar under red light. If something can sit quietly under guard for decades without explanation, what does that say about who is really being contained? I didn't leave the Air Force with answers. I left with an awareness that answers were never the objective. Civilian life is loud in ways military silence prepares you for, but not enough. Conversations drift. People fill space with certainty. They talk about what they know, what they believe, what they're sure couldn't possibly be true. I learned to listen without reacting. That was another skill that transferred cleanly. For a long time, I told myself the hangar was just a compartment in my past, something sealed, labeled, stored away. That's how we were trained to survive it. But memory doesn't obey labels. It surfaces sideways, through a smell of metal after rain, through fluorescent lights humming too loudly, through the feeling that a room is paying attention to you. I noticed changes in myself before I named them. A reluctance to speculate, a discomfort with absolutes, an instinct to measure words like they might carry consequences long after they're spoken. People call that caution. I knew it was conditioning that never stood down. What stayed with me most wasn't fear. Fear fades. What remained was a persistent sense of misalignment, like the world everyone agreed on was slightly out of register with the one I had briefly touched. Not better, not worse, just undeniably different. I was asked once, years later, by someone who knew my service record but not its margins, whether I believed we were alone. I remember pausing longer than expected. Not for drama, for accuracy. Alone is the wrong word. What I saw didn't feel like an invasion. It didn't feel like contact. It felt like proximity without permission. Like discovering a door in your house that was always there, quietly locked. Not because something wanted to get in, but because you were never meant to open it. I don't claim to know intent. That's important. Anyone who tells you they do is selling something. There was no message, no gesture, no signal I could identify as communication. Just presence, just endurance. Just a kind of patience that made our urgency look childish by comparison. The government didn't need to invent a story to hide it. It only needed to fragment the truth until it couldn't stand on its own. A rumor here, a denial there, a joke in a press briefing. People don't fear what they can ridicule. And the rest? The rest was handled by time. I waited decades to speak because I wanted to be sure of one thing, that I wasn't doing this to be believed. Belief is unstable. It swings, it hardens, it fractures communities. I'm not here to convince you of anything. I'm here because silence has a shelf life. At a certain point, the weight of carrying something unshared becomes heavier than the consequences of releasing it. I reached that point quietly, without ceremony. No revelation, no trigger event. Just the understanding that if I didn't speak now, I never would. And if no one ever speaks, the structure that depends on silence remains perfectly intact. I don't expect validation. I don't expect acknowledgement. I don't expect anything to change tomorrow, or next year, or in my lifetime. Control doesn't dissolve that easily. It adapts. It waits. All I know is this. I stood inside a hangar that officially does not exist, looking at an object that did not fit inside any category I was taught to trust, guarded by men who understood that their role was not discovery, but containment. Not of the object, of the implications. So I'll leave you where I live now, in the space between knowing and being able to prove, with the question that never made it into any report, any archive, any sanctioned history. If the truth has been quietly managed for so long, not through force, but through silence, how would you recognize it, even if it finally stepped into the light?